Another action-packed week of high school football down for the Tri-County area. This is Richard Walker, Gazette and Star Sports Editor. I'm Joe Hughes, Gazette Sports Writer, and we're here to recap what happened in Week 6 and look forward to Week 7. Of course, I'm still a little peeved at myself.
I think we both share that emotion.
Had the opportunity, it only comes around once in a while. The 21st night of September.
Yeah.
Would have lent itself to a great lead, but
yeah. I don't know if it's age or bad memory or both, but certainly those of us that deal in musical sort of things, yeah, I've been blessed to have been to 3 Earth, Wind & Fire concerts, one of the best bands ever. We didn't honor them last Friday. I didn't even realize that was a thing until last Friday. I did note on Twitter with a photo that I had shot at a concert I saw recently. But yeah, I mean, special day for any music fan in the world, but a special day for high school football last Friday too.
Especially Kobe Pacehour.
Yes.
Kings Mountain wide receiver set a school record, 288 yards receiving against Stuart Kramer. He was the difference.
Yeah.
And,
based on current records, it's the 13th highest receiving total in state history. There could have been some other yardage totals this year, but enough 4 of those are from our region.
Wow.
Cameron Dollar, who caught his first career touchdown pass for the Charlotte 49ers Friday from East Lincoln, had a 300-yard receiving game against Christ the King. Sage Surratt had a big receiving game against Maiden. Lincoln actually lost. Maiden, quarterback then by Caleb Farley, now at Virginia Tech. And Tyshawn Odom of Crest still has the Cleveland County record of 298 in a 60-40 playoff game 2 years ago against, I believe, East Rowan. So Kobe Pacehour in rare air in state history and certainly local history for a receiving game. And from the sound of it, they needed every bit of that to hold off a real pesky, feisty Stuart Kramer team in the opening of their defense of the Big South title after going 7-0 last year. Kings Mountain had a struggle at home against a very game Storm team. Home field rules in the Big South is interesting. I wrote about this a little bit in the Shelby Star version of the 3 things we learned. You do the 5 things we learned in Gaston County each Sunday. The home teams were unblemished at home. What does that mean moving forward? Maybe not much, but I will say this. I did look it up. In the history of the conference, which started in 2001, only 2 conference champions have ever lost a home game on the way to the championship. Obviously, that stands to reason because I believe of the 17 previous years, I think 13 or 14 years were unbeaten championship. You were unbeaten both home and away, so you're good on all fields. But certainly holding serve in your home field is key to winning this conference, which has been extraordinarily competitive, and this year may be as competitive as it's ever been. I mean, you know, a lot of the coaches, it's like a common theme after each week about how tough the league is, and I know the coaches certainly believe that, and the results Friday did not change that opinion, I don't think.
Not at all. it really, as we said, Kings Mountain had a dogfight, but they might have had the toughest matchup out of everybody that was at home. Take a look at Bessemer City's weird win over Mount Ella Charter.
Well, maybe it's not so weird. At some point, they get credit for being the team that is able to defend Mountain Island Charter. And that's kind of, we wrote that in our story, and I think both of us wrote it, I mean, whatever it is, Mountain Island Charter racks up big numbers against all these teams. Bessemer City, whatever they're doing on defense, seems to have figured out what Mountain Island Charter's doing. And it's kind of fascinating because if you do comparative scores, this doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
The reason I say that is they only had 106 yards of total offense.
Yeah.
Mountain Island Charter basically outgained them by 3 or 1, and still could not win the game.
Yeah.
Part of that has to do with the fact they turned the ball over, I think it was 5 times.
Sure.
But 106 total yards. You have next to nothing. Mountain Island Charter's defense did its job. Mm-hmm. Their offense obviously didn't do their job, and that's the reason why they're again looking at the 8 ball and the Southern people.
Now they got to run the table.
Exactly, and that's going to be
tough
to do.
And that starts this week. Yeah.
Union Academy's no walk in the park.
Yep.
But we've already talked a little bit about Big South 3A and how tough it is. It always comes back to 3 teams: Hunter Huss, Crest, Kings Mountain.
Crest looked really impressive against Forest View because I still think Forest View's looking for that game to reward them for the hard work they put in, but Crest was having none of it and had a school record 102-yard interception return. Mm-hmm. I mean, they had some big plays in that game. And Crest may be really figuring it out after losing to Weddington, which no slouch, but clearly I think got a lot of people's attention that Crest would lose after the Shelby game. But you know, that's maybe kind of the perfect storm, literally and figuratively. Hurricane Florence comes in, moves the game up 2 days. It comes the week after an emotional win over Shelby after Crest had lost to Shelby for 2 straight years. But Crest certainly bounced back in a big way in conference play against Forest View. And then the other one, too, Hunter Huss had their way with Norcaston, and that may say more about how good Huss is than how much Norcaston's struggling. But Norcaston, you know, their offense, when they've got to be able to score some points, and it got my attention for Huss to be able to shut them out, because I have respect for Norcaston's offense.
It kind of, the way Huss dominated North Gaston, it kind of reminds me of how Clemson went to Georgia Tech. They just they just handled business and went about and moved on. When I look at Huss, they're probably the most complete team out of the 3 of them, because they can beat you in many different ways. Their stats will not pop out at you. They're not a big team as far as running the ball. They're not a big team as far as passing the ball. Defensively, they're outstanding.
Yep.
And looking back at the stats that I've had an opportunity to look at over the weekend, no team has more ways that they can score. Jaheed Mullen has, I think he has 3 kickoff returns. Tony Davis had a punt return for a touchdown as well. No team can probably beat you with as many ways as they can.
Every night, every week in the Big South is going to be a battle for these teams.
Right.
And then you got Ashbrook, who's off to a good start, and they're choosing a non-conference game, and wait for it at South Point. So, challenging effort for South Point and Ashbrook this week in that game.
Should be a slugfest.
Should be.
And speaking of, what really catches your eye about that particular game? It has to be one of our games of the week.
Yeah, it's interesting. The series dates all the way back to 1924, if you count Old Belmont High School and Old Gastonia High School. And the series, if you include that, is even. 28-28 with 4 ties. But in recent years, South Point has won 15 straight games. 13 straight games. I'm sorry, I can't read in my own writing. But, you know, there's so much chemistry between coaching staffs. You know, Joe Shepard, who used to be Ashbrook's head coach, is now on the South Point side as an assistant. Brian Andrew, who used to be a South Point assistant, is now a head coach at Ashbrook.
Right.
John Devine, who led South Point to a couple of state titles, is now on the Ashbrook side as an assistant coach. So there's an awful lot of kinship and respect between the 2 coaching staffs. And I think Ashbrook's probably in their best position to beat them, but yeah, I would pick South Point, but I don't have a great deal of conviction of that. I can see this being one of our exciting games of the week this week.
I'll be at Highland Tech, Bessemer City, and that game is actually taking on a little bit more importance based on what happened last week, especially with Bessemer City, which can actually not only even the record, but go to 2-0 in Southern Piedmont with that.
Bessemer 17-0 all time against Highland Tech. There's only been a handful of close games. The closest 10 years ago, 16-12 win, also at Bessemer City. I'm curious to see how Highland Tech responds to the first sign of adversity they've had this year. Yeah. Does Bessemer City come back flat a little bit after that big win at Mount Lion Charter? Because as you pointed out, the statistics portray a different story than the score does, but you know, you got to win the game, and Bessemer City found a way to win. How do they deal with Highland Tech's defense, which has shown at times some vulnerability against things that perhaps Bessemer City will try to do? Also, how do they combat what has turned into a really talented dual backfield with Caleb Foster and Jeremiah Wallace for Highland Tech?
Yes, yeah.
Arguably the best tandem since that school resumed football in 2001. And again, we've said it before, you can't give David DeLeo and his staff enough credit for what they've done. And like I said, previous staffs at Highland Tech have had a little bit of part of trying to help build this program in a position. They're still seeking their second conference win. You know, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. I mean, there's a lot of negatives historically going against Highland Tech this week, but boy, the eye test and just looking at the numbers tells you they're a whole different Ram than they were before.
Yeah, Caleb Foster has averaging over 150 yards per game thus far. Of course, we were talking about Hunter Huss going to Burns. That's a bit of a trap game for them, I think. Certainly, because you look at the records, 5-0 versus 2-3, and
Huss has got Kings Mountain and Crest coming up, so you know, I don't think they can afford to look ahead, because I think Burns, this is one of those games where Burns has got to look at it. If they're going to have the season they want to have, this is the kind of game they've got to show some spirit and competitiveness and perhaps pull out a win. I mean, it's a tough game for them, but you know, they beat Shelby early in the year. Nobody thought that was a possibility. And that Alexander Central loss that people kind of, oh, they don't have it, looks a lot better now because Alexander Central is unbeaten and doing real well in the Northwestern 4A conference.
Exactly.
Or the Northwestern 3A, 4A conference. I believe they're a 3A team and a 3A, 4A combo, I believe is what that is.
Right. Yeah, and in Cherville, you have another kind of, it's an important game in the grand scheme of Southern Piedmont 1A. We have Community School of Davidson, which is now 1-0 conference against Cherville, who's coming off a loss to Thomas Jefferson. It's an interesting game mainly because of the fact that Cherville, you look at their offensive output, they scored 20 points, but just like we were talking about with Bessemer City and how numbers can be deceiving, that 20 points is rather deceiving of how much they struggled last week.
And, you know, how does Community School of Davidson come in after going up 41-32 win? Obviously, they showed some offensive production. And when you look at the recent matchups with Cherville and Community School of Davidson, they've been generally high scoring. Last year, 34-33 at Community School of Davidson. So I expect that to be one of those games that we'll be waiting for a result possibly around the 10 o'clock to 10:30 hour, because I can see this game running.
Right.
Another interesting game I find is Shelby at Mount Pleasant. They've never played a regular season game until this Friday. Now they've met a lot, 4 times in the playoffs. Shelby has won all of them, but they've been for the Western Finals in 07, the Western Finals in 2014, and the Western Semifinals in 15 and last year. So obviously there's some familiarity with coaching staffs, and they threw this game in there together. It's Shelby played South Point of South Carolina last year. This is the fill-in game for that, and then Shelby starts their conference play. But I mean, an intriguing game, and Shelby, after a week off, got a chance to really celebrate that surprising win over Kings Mountain that very few people, other than the folks inside that locker room, saw coming. So that's an interesting non-conference matchup this late in the year, and given that they've met in the playoffs so many times, possibly a preliminary to a playoff game down the road.
Yeah, and suddenly for West Lincoln at Maiden, that's suddenly a big matchup for them, especially after coming off a 7-6 loss to North Lincoln last week. And Maiden, of course, is the favorite in that conference.
Last time West Lincoln won that matchup, 1985. So we're a couple of generations ago.
Yeah, I was 2.
Yeah.
So that's a long time ago.
And then East Lincoln has been a great matchup, but East Lincoln has had their way. They've won 6 of the last 7 games, including 12-7 last year. And Lincoln looks to be as vulnerable as they've ever been in recent memory. So, at home, is this the last stand for the Wolves this year? I mean, this is obviously, if they don't need any more motivation than seeing the green and orange on the other side to get them stoked up. But should be an interesting game up at Battleground Stadium, Von Harris Field.
And East Lincoln has won 3 in a row. Other games, Crest at Stuart Kramer, both of those teams. Crest coming off that 51 I think it was 8 win over Forest View. Stuart Kramer 28-23 losers at Kings Mountain. East Gaston at Forest View.
I've got to make a moment. Sad day for all of us here in the Gaston County community. John Hunsucker, longtime cross country coach and teacher at Forest View, passed away yesterday. We're doing this taping on Tuesday. I know we'll have more in the paper, the specifics, but they're having a Thursday night candlelight vigil at the school. They're going to have a ceremony before the game with East Gaston. East Gaston Athletic Director Ryan Resendez, a former Forest View student, athlete that knew Mr. Hunsucker. And then tentatively right now, some kind of visitation arranged for Saturday, but check the GastonGazette.com. I know we're currently working on a story about Mr. Hunsucker's untimely death, and it really fractured up a lot of people in the Forest View and Greer communities. In fact, one of the persons I talked to, Jamar McCoy, Hunter Huss coach, was in one of Coach Hunsucker's last years because he was at Greer Junior High before becoming an original member of the Forest View staff in 1998. So there'll be a ceremony before the game honoring his memory, and kind of a tough time in the Forest View community to lose such a coaching giant and a teaching giant. I mean, a guy that anybody that was at that school has some kind of familiarity and has a good feeling about it.